Professor Joas, you are one of the most original and influential voices in the contemporary sociological debate on secularization. So I would like to start our conversation by asking you directly, what is your favorite definition of the phenomenon that commonly goes under this label, secularization?
I would say that secularization is a notoriously ambiguous term, and I've often distinguished 7 different meanings, which of course leads to many misunderstandings in the debates, because one of the participants might use one meaning and the other a different meaning, and they do not really understand each other well. Now, since Charles Taylor brought out his big book, Secular Age, one even has to add an 8th meaning to it, and I don't think it makes sense if I run through the whole list. So I just focus on the fact that when I speak about secularization, what I normally mean is decline of religion. But other people have totally different meanings in mind. Taylor, for example, means the availability of what he calls a secular option. That means that if there is the possibility not to be a believer, this changes the conditions for faith, even for those who are believers. And still other people speak about secularization in the sense of a release of societal spheres from religious control, that in art or in science or in the economy, things can be done without the anticipation of religious measures taken against a certain artist, scientist, or businessman. But I concentrate on this meaning decline of religion. Now this in itself is also not as clear as one would want it to be, because the question is, how do we measure a decline in religion? We can measure it, for example, by counting members in churches or religious organizations. We can measure it by asking people about their faith in God, in an afterlife, or similar things. And of course, we can ask people how often they participate in certain religious rituals. Now, the numbers we get are not identical or do not show development in parallel ways, so to speak, because people may remain members of churches but stop going to religious services on Sundays, for example. Do we talk about a decline in this case or not? So there are all sorts of practical, empirical, sociological problems. But the main fact I'm talking about when I'm talking about secularization is the vitality or the decline of religion in a very general sense.
There's a heated debate on the fate of religion in contemporary Western societies, not restricted to the academia. So what is, in your view, well, the best, most suitable label for this predicament? End of religion, decline, or revival of religion, and why?
Okay, I mean, it's really an empirical question, and the world is very heterogeneous in this regard. Even Europe is very heterogeneous. So it's not possible to really use one and the same label for religious developments all over the world, as if we could identify one main tendency that is true everywhere. Perhaps, for example, an important phenomenon of the present is that there is an ongoing decline of religion in many Western European societies, in very few non-European societies, mostly so-called settler societies, Australia, New Zealand, parts of Canada today. But at the same time, where we can observe this decline of religion in these few societies, there is an enormous expansion, for example, of Christianity and of Islam in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa, in parts of Asia, and even in China. So it's not possible to use one and the same label. I certainly think that we should not speak of something like the return of religion. What I think what has changed in the last 10 years in Europe is more a renewed attempt attention to the phenomena, to the phenomenon of religion in Europe. But that's not a return. It's not a return for the simple reason that religion had never disappeared. It was just the fact that many people assumed, many intellectuals particularly assumed, that religion will disappear, and then they suddenly realize it doesn't disappear, and they are so surprised that they speak about revitalization, post-secularity, and such things. But in terms of numbers of members of religious organizations, for example, there is not a dramatic change toward an increase in Europe in the last 10 years.
The contemporary quarrel between militant atheists and self-appointed advocates of faith often arises from different interpretation of the role played by Christianity in the Western process of civilization. What's your mind about it? How much does religious identity really count in people's identity?
Yeah, maybe these are two different questions. One is the more historical question. What was the role Christianity played in the history of Europe? And the other is, what is the role religion plays today? Let me first of all say that I think we have to be very careful in the following conceptual sense, that religion is not an entity that can play a specific causal role as such. There is no such thing out in the world as religion. The only thing that is there out in the world, I would say, with regard to such socio-political matters, is human beings and their organizations and institutions. Okay, if that is true, it is clear from the outset that religious orientations are always only part of what human beings are. Of course they have, let's say, immediate corporeal needs. They have all sorts of material interests. They have political convictions. They have moral convictions. And of course, as human beings, they integrate that, or they try to integrate that with their religious experiences, their religious convictions, and so on. But that never leads to a really closed whole. So even in a time where everybody is deeply religious, it's not true that the only thing that matters is a religious conviction. That was an old era, I would say. For example, in the Durkheimian tradition of sociological studies about religion, and my, let's say, counter-notion to this idea of the completely holistically religious actor is something like to say, even people who believe in a river god know how to construct dams. You know, they may pray to the river god to protect them, but they also have technical abilities to do something against the water, and they develop worldviews in which they balance their experiences based on everyday life with the experiences of as Max Weber would have said, non-quotidian, non-everyday life, extraordinary character. So even at a time where everybody is religious, and this is of course all the more true when some people do not even define themselves in religious terms.
There's a widespread tendency among the advocates of the civilizing function of religion to emphasize religion's civil or political dimension, namely to call attention to, well, this is called civil religion or political theology putatively built into liberal societies. What are, in your view, the pros and the cons this line of thought about religion?
I mean, first of all, I would say here we are talking about, not about religion as such, but about Christianity, and maybe about several other religions that I would call post-axial religions, following the terminology of Karl Jaspers, namely religions of a universalist kind. You know, an ironic way to put it would be to say, but nobody says that the totemism of the Australian Aborigines is a necessary precondition for the functioning of democracy. Yeah? But when we say religion, why not the totemism of the Australian Aborigines or of Native Americans? So what we mean, I think, when we say that, is a universalistic religion. Universalistic here means a religion that teaches us to see, let's say, the misery, the suffering, not just of ourselves, not just of those people who are in some sense affectually close to us, but of all human beings, even of the human beings of the future. This, I would say, contains in itself a kind of response to your question, namely, if we are believers in a universalistic religion, we can never identify the demands of our religion with the demands of a specific political order. It always transcends the political order. So such a religion can never justify itself by its usefulness for a specific political order. This would already reduce the universalistic character of this religion. So my main emphasis would always be on this transcending of a specific political order, that we may say at the moment we think that a democratic political order, some form of market as a principle of the economic order, a catalogue of human rights, that these are the best foundations for a political order. Yeah? But I say that in the sense of a kind of historical contingency, yeah? Because from my religion it might follow that I realize this is still too much thinking in terms of nation states, for example. This still allows people in other nation states to die from starvation. So maybe I'm wrong, and I have so far identified too much with this specific political order of a world organized in terms of nation states, and so Christianity drives me beyond that. I think that leads to a kind of healthy distance to every use or misuse of Christianity for the justification of a specific political order.